everybody. We are still waiting for 3 p.m. when we will start our event. In the meantime, I would like to welcome to the early birds that are joining us a little earlier. And if you like, please let us know from where you are connecting using the chat. Thank you very much. Thank you. I see that many of you are answering my question. Thank you very much. Welcome again. As we give it one more minute of wait, I would like to remind everybody that today we have interpretation available in Spanish, French, and Portuguese. So if you would like to listen in another language that is not English, please look on the bottom of your screen, and there is a globe icon with the interpretation sign. Thank you. We are about to start. Very well. I think we can start. Thank you, Megan. And welcome, everybody. I hope that everybody has the opportunity to listen in the language of their choice. We have interpretation again available in French, Spanish, and Portuguese today. So, esteemed participants and valued guests, welcome to the 5th edition of gLOCAL Evaluation Week. It's a pleasure to welcome you today. My name is Patricia Koka, and I'm the Communications and Knowledge Management Lead of the GEI. And today I will be your host. Over the past few years, gLOCAL has become what I think is a groundbreaking week-long online gathering that we hope will inspire and enhance the work that we do in the field of evaluation. It is an honor to address you today as we embark on this virtual journey of knowledge sharing and collaboration that we hope will inspire transformative action. gLOCAL2023 is hosted by the Global Evaluation Initiative and unites evaluation enthusiasts from across the globe, in the hope that we can create and really move forward a movement and collectively shape the future of the evaluation practice. Over the next few days, we will immerse ourselves in a tapestry of discussions, workshops, interactive sessions that reflects the event's core themes. And together, we will explore innovative approaches to evaluation, discuss the power of technology and data-driven evaluation, or how to better integrate evaluation into the decision-making process. As you will participate into some of the 300+ events that have been organized for the gLOCAL Evaluation Week, you will have the opportunity to engage with expert practitioners, policymakers who have dedicated their lives in advancing evaluation excellence. But we hope that this week will represent much more than just a collection of great sessions. We hope that this is the opportunity for you to connect with a global community of evaluation enthusiasts. Thousands of people have registered to gLOCAL, and I want to encourage you to make an effort to share ideas, but also to forge partnerships that transcend boundaries. So please let us know where you are connecting from in the chat if you haven't done that yet. And finally, allow me to take this opportunity to thank all the people that are making this week possible, from the tireless coordinators of the GEI global team and CLEAR centers, to all the partner organizations, to every and each organizer that is contributing to this knowledge sharing event from every corner of the globe. Thank you again for being part of this event and enjoy gLOCAL Evaluation Week 2023. And now it's my honor to introduce you Jos Vassen. He will be the moderator of today's event, but Jos is also the evaluation advisor at the IAG and deputy head of the GEI. Jos, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia, and welcome to all online. It's great to have you here, and we look forward to an exciting discussion. So welcome to today's opening event on the future of monitoring and evaluation, culture, context, and collaboration. As you know, monitoring and evaluation are different but complementary activities that generate evidence about policy interventions. And in practice, we see that the two are closely intertwined, and the institutionalization of both practices in public policy often go hand in hand. This week, we will celebrate the breadth of monitoring and evaluation systems and practices with a future-oriented perspective. Now, in our opening event, we are going to talk about two important topics within the broader theme of the Evaluation Week. Our event is therefore divided into two parts. In the first part, we will talk about the future of M&E systems development at the national level, and I will introduce this topic in a minute. In the second part of the event, we will discuss the future of evaluative practices, and more specifically, the issue of how evidence is being generated and shared. I'm very pleased to have a very distinguished panel of speakers for this event, and I will introduce them as they enter the stage. Each of the two parts will start with short presentations from the panelists, 2 presentations in the first part and 3 in the second one. And after each set of presentations, we will have a brief space for follow-up questions with the panelists, and then we also have space for a few questions from the audience. So please do not hesitate to enter your questions into the Q&A box of Zoom. There's a little icon there that says Q&A. As we do not know how many questions to expect, the panelists may not be able to respond to all of your questions, but we will endeavor to bring some of them into the conversation. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the first part of the event. Esteemed colleagues, over the last 2 decades, what we have seen across the globe is an increase in the number of countries that have adopted legislation or policies for monitoring and evaluation at the national level. Often this evolution has gone hand in hand with the development of some type of structure for monitoring and evaluation in government. While we see that there are promising advances in some countries, we also see that in other countries there has been less progress, or even in some cases regress. So to explore this issue more deeply, a number of questions come to mind. First of all, considering the evolution in national M&E systems in recent years in different parts of the world, going forward, what are the main opportunities and challenges for strengthening the institutionalization of M&E in public policy? But also, how can we develop resilient monitoring and evaluation systems that can withstand and outlast institutional uncertainties and volatilities? To explore these and other questions, we have 2 distinguished speakers on this topic, both with extensive experience in the field of national M&E systems and capacity development. And it is my great pleasure to introduce to you the first speaker, Dougan Fraser. Dougan is the program manager of the Global Evaluation Initiative. So Dougan, it is my pleasure to give you the floor and kick off today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jos. I hope I'm clearly audible. It's very, very nice to be on the call, and I hope that this is the beginning of a very exciting week where people learn new things and share some of the things that they've had an opportunity to learn. When we talk about national monitoring and evaluation systems, they are the absolute heart of the future of the human experience, particularly in relation to our ability to deliver public goods to people who need them wherever they may be. And in many ways, I think you would not be overstressed stretching the analogy if you were to talk about national M&E systems as being similar to food gardens. They are gardens that are going to be producing the nutrients that we need to survive what is no doubt going to be a very, very challenging future. And we need to start thinking about them in the same way, with a deferred intentionality that is similar to the ways in which we approach food gardening. If you can go on to the next slide, Megan. When we think about national monitoring and evaluation systems, it's very easy to lapse into a very problematic colonial and imperial way of understanding the production of knowledge. And it's a way that sees this as an endeavor reserved for white men who are managing and constructing intricate apparatus to deliver nutrients to themselves. And I think that that is exactly the energy and exactly the culture that we are trying to overcome and put behind us when we think about national monitoring and evaluation systems of the future. These intricate, mechanical, and problematic interventions are not the way that we are going to be able to deliver knowledge that we need. And if you can move on to the next one. The other way we often understand monitoring and evaluation systems is as highly sterile, piped ducts that deliver data to where we need them. And I would argue that that too is not the best way to understand national monitoring and evaluation systems. Unfortunately, life is always far messier and much less shiny. Next slide. What I would argue is often the case in national monitoring and evaluation systems is a number of problems. They relate to certain things that I want to just run through with you quickly now. The first is that often monitoring and evaluation systems are misplaced. They are located in institutions in the wrong directorate, or in country governments, they're based in the wrong ministry. And sometimes this has the effect of limiting the operations of those kinds of institutions. National monitoring and evaluation systems need to be very, very mindful of how they are positioned in the macro organizations of country governments. And this is something we're starting to get better at and developing opinions, because of course there isn't one right way. There are only a number of different options that you can explore, which will be appropriate to your context. And this question of context is going to come up repeatedly. If you can go on to the next one. The other problem we find in national monitoring and evaluation systems is just that flat out they are undercapacitated. They do not have the power that they need to do the things that they're expected to do. And as a result of this, oftentimes they deliver a product that doesn't meet the need of people who are having to make decisions. Typically, monitoring and evaluation systems produce evidence too late. And that's generally one of the reasons why they're often regarded as being of less help than they can be. And if we can go on to the next one. The other thing that happens in a lot of monitoring and evaluation systems is that they misfire and they fire back at the person who's pulling the trigger. Oftentimes evidence that is produced is poorly packaged, it isn't meaningfully shared, people aren't given an opportunity to engage with it, and it means that information and evidence produced through national monitoring and evaluation systems isn't optimally utilized. And that's something that is related to the two previous problems that I've addressed of undercapacitation and being misplaced. You can go on to the next one. The other final thing that we find in a lot of monitoring and evaluation systems is that they don't have the scope and breadth of what is required of them in order to be fit for purpose. Oftentimes in country governments, we discover that national monitoring and evaluation systems are really monitoring systems. It's not unusual to run into contexts where people are not doing evaluation at all. And the only evaluation that gets done is by donors. And that is such a profoundly problematic way of doing evaluations, because it means that the evidence is always understood to be part of a development assistance agenda rather than an indigenous learning opportunity. We can go on to the next slide. And the other thing about monitoring and evaluation systems that we run up against is that they often don't have the political coverage that they need. There isn't the willingness, the bravery, the heart to get wet and to hear what is being revealed through monitoring and evaluation systems. We can go on to the next one. But despite these problems and despite these shortcomings, I think it's really important that we recognize that national monitoring and evaluation systems are generally, I would argue, much stronger now than they were 10, 15 years ago. In many, many ways, as Jos said in his opening, monitoring and evaluation systems are really taking off. They've been institutionalized. Oftentimes there's legislation empowering them. There is usually some or other policy in place. And the point is that where we are today compared to where we were in, say, 2003 is remarkably different. Go on to the next one. I think the one thing that we are still, I would argue, unsure of is exactly what the impact of technology is going to be. I don't think that future evaluations are going to be done the way we do them now. I think it's going to be about getting your ChatGPT prompt right. And that skill of being able to issue a good prompt is something that's very exciting. I think that when we think about the role that technology is going to play and its ability to access information much more quickly, we're in for a real roller coaster ride. And if we can go on to the next one. If we get it right, if we manage this deferred intentionality, I would argue that we will be in a good place to build these nourishing food gardens of the future. They will be contextually appropriate. They will relate to people's culture. And ultimately, and more than anything, what will make them resilient is the relationships that underpin them. The fact that people are connected both in person and virtually means that national monitoring and evaluation systems are better placed than ever before. And I'll leave it there and give it back to you, Jos. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Dugan. Very interesting summary overview of the main components of national M&E systems, the importance of context specificity, the importance of political will, capacities to deliver quality evidence. And I really love the metaphor of nurturing a garden, which really points at the long-term nature of building national M&E systems. It's now my great pleasure and privilege to introduce our second speaker for today. So Candice, please share your slides. Candice Morkel is the director of the Center for Learning on Evaluation and Results for Anglophone Africa. And this center is also part of the Global Evaluation Network. We can see your slides now, Candice, so the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jos, and thank you to Dugan, because I think a lot of what I'm going to say now aligns very strongly with what Dugan's just pointed out to us. And just to say how very pleased I am that there are so many of you here. It's wonderful to be in a session where, I think we've got more than 300 participants. So I really hope that you do feel that you are welcomed, and thank you for spending your time with us. So, of course, I'm going to be talking to you about some of the opportunities and challenges as well from my perspective, and also the perspective of CLEAR AA, because a lot of our work, we spend our time with country governments, in country, working alongside in partnership with governments and other multilateral partners to build and or strengthen national evaluation systems. So I'll just share with you some of what we've observed over time in this regard. So first of all, the first challenge that we've observed is the challenge of instrumentalism. And what I mean here is public administration instrumentalism, or instrumentalism in public policy, where there's the danger of creating the bureaucratic structures and the systems and the policies and everything that you need to produce the evidence for the sake of having that system in existence to comply with these national and international pressures for evidence-informed decision-making, without necessarily really valuing the importance of M&E systems to public policy making and for real development impact. And so, therefore, these systems, they're existing, they're producing the evidence. Budgets available for evaluations for the monitoring systems. There are people, involved in doing the work, but we haven't really ensured that they have real influence in the public policy making process. And so we can talk about benign or contemptuous compliance, Benign compliance, meaning that, yes, it's there and everybody is happy that the system exists and everybody complies and produces the evidence and they get presented in the right places, but they have no real impact in the policy-making space. And then sometimes even contemptuous compliance where they are actually vilified in the system and, nobody really wants to talk to the M&E people. So the challenge of instrumentalism, where we have these systems existing for the sake of existing, is something that we really have to be careful of. The second one is, in our efforts to have champions, we might have developed some kind of over-dependence on champions. And here we're not talking about necessarily individuals, right? They could be individuals, but they could be departments or units or programs or ministries. And the challenge with this is that when we have these very, very strong champions upon whom the entire national evaluation system, exists, and they really form a very strong pillar, when they are exposed to the volatilities of, either bureaucratic shifts or political shifts, then the entire evaluation system also collapses, or the M&E system collapses, or it really does regress. And we found this over and over again, where there's this over-reliance on one particular actor to really carry the entire system. It collapses when something happens, politically, to create a shift in the administration. Thirdly, we can talk about the weaknesses in coordination and integrated governance. And I mean, this, of course, isn't unique to the M&E sector, or, the problem of M&E it's not unique to M&E. But I think what happens is that the duplication of efforts in general and the lack of coordination in bureaucracies and systems of governance obviously manifests in the M&E system as. So often what happens is that there's a contestation of mandates. Sometimes the way in which administrations are set up, or the way in which budgets are allocated, you have very separate mandates that aren't integrated at all, maybe in policy and on paper, but in real politics, it's not really very integrated. And then you'll have the contestation happening with the production of evidence as well. Very often what we've seen is that policy units are operating alongside, strategic planning and national planning units or programs. And then the M&E units and the M&E programs are also then in parallel to all of these. And so the lack of integration has also really been one of the challenges that we've observed, that is not only unique to M&E, but the entire system of bureaucratic governance. Shifting quickly to some of the opportunities, what can we do, or where are the levers that we can use in this regard? One of them is transformational thinking. Now, I know it's been a bit of a buzzword. All of us are talking about transformational thinking, but I really do believe that we need to have more deliberate efforts to ensure that M&E systems are integrated into the entire machinery and the way of doing business in governance. What we find is that, building the culture of valuing M&E systems is something that is relegated to one particular unit. But I think that in order to find the entire system changing, we have to have that throughout the system, whether it is at the technical level or at the political level. You have to have those kind of changes really advocated for throughout the entire system. And this will require a lot of hard work in this kind of transformational thinking. Capacity development is always going to be there, but what I want to really point out is that we might have focused all our attention on the supply side, but we really need to be focusing on the demand side as well. I had the good fortune of sitting in a presentation a couple of days ago where evaluation results were presented to senior leadership. But unfortunately, the gap and the opportunity that was lost, the opportunity that was given and handed in that particular environment was lost because there was lack of clarity on what the senior leadership needed to do with that evidence. Besides the creation of plans to, address the recommendations, but really within the system, how do we use evidence in the system? One could tell was lost within the bureaucratic machinery of how governance works. And lastly, collaboration is everything. We need a whole of government, whole of society effort to ensure that there's widespread understanding of the value of M&E system to avoid the instrumentalism that creeps in sometimes. If we have better advocacy, better demand from both the state and non-state actors working together, the demand for robust evidence from national M&E systems. That is something that, absolutely we cannot rely on one particular actor to drive the entire system, and you need the collaboration of development partners as well as government working together. Thank you so much, Jos. Back over to you.
Thank you very much, Candice, in what is a really interesting and complementary perspective on national M&E system development. I really appreciate also your emphasis on some of the important risks and challenges that these systems face. Ritualization is a true risk, and we are all aware of it, but it's very difficult to address ritualization, for example. And also the reliance on one of you or a few champions in the system makes the system quite vulnerable. So these are excellent points. Thank you very much, Candice. So esteemed colleagues, we have room for some questions. I would like to ask you to start inserting any questions that you have in the Q&A window. In the meantime, I would like to kick off the discussion by asking a few questions to our esteemed panelists. And let me start with Dugan. Dugan, a question to you. Given your experience as in terms of leading the Global Evaluation Initiative, we know that the Global Evaluation Initiative is working in contexts that are sometimes quite challenging. They can be challenging for political, economic, or security reasons. So in your experience, what are some of the most important building blocks for M&E systems to have in place so they can withstand such conditions, so they become more resilient? Over to you, Dugan.
I think perhaps the thing I enjoy the most about my job, and which is characteristic of the GEI, is its emphasis on relationships. And I think that the most effective way of, I guess, preparing for and managing disasters and crises is by having good, strong, close relationships with people. And these relationships need to be based on trust. They need to be built on an understanding that you share a set of interests and that one party's success is everyone's success. I think resilience is best fostered when people know one another, when they're able to connect with one another, and that makes a huge difference. I'll come back to this question if we have time a bit later, Jos.
Thank you very much, Dugan. A question for you, Candice, and please feel also free to chime in, others. You also spoke about, to some extent, fragmented M&E systems. We know that in some countries, M&E systems are quite well advanced. There's a strong country-led tradition in M&E planning, coordination, and implementation. But in other countries, we see that monitoring and evaluation is still mostly donor-driven and often highly fragmented with very little coordination and collaboration. So working in such a context, what are some of the key steps to undertake in terms of trying to reduce that fragmentation and really develop national capacity and national ownership?
Thanks very much, Jos. And certainly, I think building, in fact, on what Dugan just spoke about now, which is relationships, I think that is a key aspect of it. And in addition to that, or linked to that, is the notion of country-owned approaches. And I think this is built on, being a true ally and a true collaborator or partner, I think, when one is working with countries, not going in there with the assumption that the technical expertise is what that country needs in order for that, system to operate very effectively. Donor coordination is something that we spoke about at the NEC conference last year, for example, and I think that's one of the steps that needs to be taken. I think often there's contestation, perhaps between partners or amongst partners, about what is required, not necessarily contestation in the sense that there's conflict, but within the government bureaucracy, they have to contend with all of these different lines of reporting or requirements and mandates. And I think that does create some kind of, fragmentation in the system as well. And I think one of the steps that can be taken is perhaps for donor coordination to be stronger. Just coming back to the issue of country-led and country-owned approaches, you would of course know that we've started really focusing our attention on good, robust diagnostics or assessments. And I think often we've rushed before in previous years or previous iterations of our work, rushed into a situation believing what we thought would be the solution without doing proper assessments. And I think doing a systematic, robust monitoring and evaluation systems analyses, diagnostics, if you wish to use that word, to understand exactly locally what the need is, because sometimes we're wanting to build evaluation systems and the production of evaluative evidence, when really it is the government administrative monitoring systems that really need the work. And I think that is where we need to get better to ensure that the coordination is going to come from understanding the context better. And once we understand the context and where we need to, come alongside government and local actors to assist where the gaps are, the coordination is going to be, I think, easier, not completely resolved, but so that we don't actually have a duplication of efforts when we're in that space. Thank you.
Yes, you're muted.
Thank you very much, Candice, for this elaborate response. Sorry, I was muted. Dugan, would you also like to comment on this question? If not, I will continue with some questions coming in from the audience. All right. All right.
The audience questions are absolutely fascinating, and I think they're definitely worth spending some time on.
Yeah. Thank you very much for inserting your questions. I'm having trouble to follow the two chat windows, so please put your questions in the Q&A window rather than in the chat window. But let's kick off with a few questions coming in. So one that I caught was a question regarding what to do when there's really low capacity and what to do when there's very little demand for M&E evidence in public policy. Suppose you have a conversation with a Minister of Planning, Minister of Finance. How would you go about it in advising and starting a collaboration in such a country context? Dugan, would you like to start with this one?
You know how you start the longest journey is always the same way, which is with a single step, right? Like you pull people together and you start the conversation, and in the beginning you'll get it wrong and people will be annoyed and they'll say, why didn't you invite me, or you talked about the wrong thing. But you do another one and you slowly get it right, and you will over time build up momentum and you will get an alliance of like-minded people around you. I mean, I think the danger is some of the issues that are being highlighted in the chat, which is around M&E as being this kind of weird discipline that's self-serving and often operates completely isolated and disconnected from the interventions themselves, either from the interventions or from policymaking and high-level politics. And those are all related to this question of how you build commitment to a system. And I think the thing that I am increasingly concerned about is how oftentimes there are parallel systems. There's the real politics system, and then there's the formal institutional bureaucratic system. And what we really want to find is a marriage of those two things. But this is about taking the long view. You can't say, I'm amazed my garden didn't deliver a crop because I watered it last year. You have to water it today, not last year. And it's maintaining these systems and building up these institutions that is the long-term job of good governance, and that'll make the difference. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Dugan. I see all sorts of questions coming in that also in part relate to our second part of the event, so I won't elaborate on those. Let me give a question to you, Candice. As you very well know from your experience, we try to focus on working with governments to build country-led M&E systems, but of course, other non-governmental actors are extremely important in the development of national M&E systems. And there was a particular question regarding the role of VOPIs. Perhaps you could elaborate a little bit on your experience of working with VOPIs.
I think that's a great question, because I think we've undervalued the leverage that a national evaluation system can get from a really strong VOPI. Many people are familiar, for example, with the South African case of the South African Monitoring and Evaluation Association and the National Department of Planning and M&E, and how they have over the last decade and a half really worked on establishing a very close relationship. And I think that what emanated out of that was also very strong capacity development, synergies where VOP is, for me, I've always seen as a space which is pretty neutral in the sense that, it reduces the hierarchies between the state and non-state actors, academia, practitioners, and so forth. It's a space where people really, in my experience, have come together as, I think what Patricia called evaluation enthusiasts, come together to share experience and to work on real problems of, strengthening the evaluation ecosystem. And I think that, of course, we've got the African Evaluation Association on the continent, which is the umbrella body, and it really has been trying very hard to make sure that I think we've got in excess of 35 associations across the continent currently. And what we really need to do is perhaps get more of the peer learning going between countries, maybe about what worked in the South African case, for example, with SAMIA. We've got Tanzania, for example, now working very closely with Tanzania as well. Can we learn from that case to say, what are they doing? Because I know that there's a very close relationship between Tanzania and the Prime Minister's office and them working together on capacity building for the state as well. So I think we've undervalued it in our discussion on national evaluation systems, but in general, in public policy making, the role of non-state actors has always been, seen as being in subordination to the state. And maybe in the evaluation sector, we could actually see a shift happening, that we can actually bring in non-state actors through VOPs to have a stronger voice in a very significant area of public policy and governance, in fact.
Thank you very much, Candice, for elaborating on this. Indeed, well, it's very difficult, and it's, as you said, it's also very context specific. There is an avalanche of questions coming in, esteemed colleagues. We will not be able to address all of them, but please keep them coming. And the ones that we cannot address here, we will endeavor to address those later on by putting out some kind of note or getting in contact with you if there were interest for that. One question that I would like to feed back to the panel, and that's actually to both, is this idea of M&E coming in as a technocratic business. There's a lot of processes that are needed, a lot of capacities that are needed, and this may lead, as Candice quite eloquently pointed out, to ritualization, people going through the motions. This is one of the big risks of our M&E business, basically. Do you have any recommendations or any experiences that you can share of trying to break through that risk of ritualization? How do you avoid it? How do you tackle it? Maybe Dugan, you would like to start, and then Candice, you can complement.
It's a difficult question. I'd much rather Candice went first.
Let me take that, because it is an important question and one that we really are, trying to tackle at the moment. But there's one key thing that we've observed in African governance systems, where there's the dominance of ministries of finance or treasuries who've pretty much directed the establishment of monitoring and evaluation systems. And I'm not talking about the donor-driven evaluation systems where evaluations of aid interventions are evaluated, but the internal machinery of reporting, performance for results and, all sorts of results-based systems. And when they are held, and these policy-making systems are quite, they're institutionalized. They kind of almost want to say brick and mortar structures that you don't mess with them. And those are the places actually where the influence for evidence-informed decision-making can really take place. It's the real politic, as Dugan mentioned. And I think we don't understand those systems well enough. We don't value them. We actually underestimate how strong these are. And so we create all of these all the other machinery around them. But when it really comes to the real business of government policy making, of the evidence that informs decision-making, of budgets, where public good delivery actually lives, evaluation is completely out in the cold. So I think that is one area where, if we are going to avoid this instrumentalism, we need to go to where the real the real politic, as we say, that where the evidence-informed decision-making is really taking place, and we need to have a seat at that table. And I think currently in many systems, we don't have a seat at that table.
Excellent point. I fully agree. Getting a seat at the table is one of the big challenges for M&E practitioners. Dugan, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I was very well advised to let Candace speak first, because now she's given me something to run with. I think for me, the way you avoid ritualizing these practices is you strengthen the systems, and you build a momentum that is so strong that it can't be ignored. And I think that in doing that, you need to do it in a way that is extremely ultra inclusive, that really seeks to make sure that voices that often get ignored or marginalized or undermined get heard loudly. And you need to do it in a way that understands that there are a multiplicity of voices, and that one's job as a systems strengthener is to create opportunities for voices to be heard and for people to participate. And that ultimately what you're really doing is acting as a facilitator. In the coming 100 years, what is going to be our stock in trade will be knowledge. And knowledge is going to be what separates success from failure. And if we as monitoring and evaluation practitioners understand ourselves to be people who are building systems that trade in knowledge, that create opportunities for people to display what they've learned and share what they know, we'll be in a much better place. And that means hooking into higher education institutions, to entities that represent practitioners like VOPs, and getting these systems strong and robust. That is how we're going to make sure that these things don't simply become compliance requirements. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Dugan. Excellent point on inclusion and collaboration. And returning to your very, I think, catchy metaphor on nurturing a garden, we basically have to ensure that we plant multiple crops. We have an intercropping system because we know from agriculture that this creates all sorts of symbiotic effects.
Didn't you train as an agricultural economist, Jos? I think you did.
I did.
Yeah, guilty as charged. No wonder you like the metaphor.
I do, and I remember the symbiotic effects of maize and beans, for example. So we need to find the maize and the beans and the others. So thank you very much, esteemed colleagues. We unfortunately, and fortunately, we have to continue with the second part of the event. We hear and see your questions. Maybe there will be a little bit of space to return to some of those in the second part, but I would like to thank the speakers of the first part and now turn over to the second part, which will really bring us from the world of M&E systems down to the world of M&E practices. Esteemed colleagues, as you know, the field of evaluation, and we will talk here more particularly about evaluation as a practice, it can be characterized by a broad diversity. We know that evaluative practices are underpinned by different worldviews. They are underpinned by different epistemological and methodological traditions. So within this daunting diversity of practices, we can ask the question, going forward, what are some of the main trends? What are some of the main opportunities, but also challenges in the ways we generate and share evidence in the field of evaluation? And there are additional important questions like, what are opportunities and challenges for using data and methods that help us make evaluative evidence more robust, but also more useful and more accessible for decision makers and other evaluation stakeholders? And finally, how can culturally responsive evaluation principles, how can they be usefully integrated with universally considered good practices or good principles of evaluation research? These are important questions when we look toward the future. And to explore these and other questions, I'm very pleased to have three distinguished speakers from different corners of the evaluation field on the panel. All three are very well known for their work on evaluation methodology and practice. And it is my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Marie Gauder, who is the Director of the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation. Marie, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Jos, and welcome and good day to everyone. Really happy to be with you today. And also happy 5th anniversary to gLOCAL. We are happy partners in the GEI initiative. In terms of the question of the changes in how evaluative evidence is being generated that I foresee, I will talk about 3 issues related to first access, second quality, and thirdly evidence literacy. Second slide, please. So there's been a significant growth in the evidence base over the last 15 years. But evidence generation, as we know, does not equal use, and uptake and use of evidence are, I'm afraid, still stubbornly lagging behind. You know, and many of us have felt this, the sheer amount of information, evaluation, and research being published and pushed to us every day can make it difficult to separate out reliable research. Therefore, free, easy access to curated evidence for all is necessary and will become crucial going forward, especially as it competes with free, easy access to non-curated, plausible, but likely biased and potentially misleading evidence. So this is why 3IE developed the Development Evidence Portal, the DEP, and you see it on the top of the slide there as well, of how it looks like if you land on our web page. The DEP is addressing the issue of reliable and easy access by providing the world's largest collection of curated, rigorous evidence on the effects of social and economic interventions in low- and middle-income countries. And it's a unique resource for researchers, knowledge brokers, and decision makers. The portal has a user-friendly interface and advanced searching and filtering options. And the DEP actually now, most recently, contains about 12,000 impact evaluations, over 1,000 systematic reviews, and 34 and counting evidence gap maps. And it is continuously being updated with new evidence as it is produced. Users can explore the evidence, this evidence according to key characteristics like sectors, geography, a taxonomy of interventions and outcomes of interest, also gender and equity dimensions. So the DEP provides really an important foundation for the global evidence architecture in and of itself, and as a tool to enable evidence translation. Evidence gap maps, which is a tool that 3IE invented in 2011 and subsequently further developed and refined, provide further curated collections of evidence on more specific topics. And there's also a visual of this on the slide on the bottom left corner. We work with partners, decision makers, and researchers to define the interventions and outcomes of interest to their particular subsector or theme. And then we search for and present the existing impact evaluations, systematic reviews according to this framework on basically our own interactive platform. And this, again, is linked to the DEP so that users can actually click through and access further details and link to full text papers on the DEP, if indeed the authors have made them open access. In addition to providing access to the available evidence, EGMs also help identify gaps in the evidence base that helps inform the decisions for where you want to focus future research. The collation and curation of evidence in the DEP and EGMs provide a basis for embedded institutionalized use and also more responsive evidence services, such as help desks and rapid systematic reviews. So to give you a couple of concrete examples, the Development Bank of Latin America, known by the acronym CAF, require their program teams to consult the DEP as a first step in ex-ante assessments of expected impacts for their programs. 3IE's EGM tool has been also adapted for use by other organizations in their decision-making and advisory capacities, such as the International Rescue Committee, South Africa's Department for Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, and Colombia's Department of Planning. And as a last example, 3IE's West Africa Capacity Building and Impact Evaluation Program and SACE, so South Africa Center for Evidence, they draw on the DEP for help desk and rapid response services, basically targeted at ongoing policy questions of high relevance. Next slide, please. So now moving from access to issues related to quality and relevance. And of course, there are many. I will just talk about a couple of issues related to quality and relevance. One of them is costs. Costs of an intervention or program are integral to policy decisions. If something has a small but positive effect, that doesn't tell us much. Should we do it? Should we do more of it? What about if something else had the same effect at a lower cost? What if something else had a larger effect at the same cost? So cost questions are really important for policymakers and decision makers, yet cost evidence lags far behind effectiveness evidence. In fact, less than 1/5 of published impact evaluations estimate cost per impact. And there are a number of contributing factors to this. Some are lack of training in cost data collection and analysis, lack of standardization of methods and assumptions, also inconsistent funder requirements for cost analysis and not providing funding to do the additional cost analysis. Currently, efforts to improve this are underway. So there are a number of tools and guidances, etc., to help doing this better. And 3IE has published a whole special issue on costing and cost effectiveness in the Journal of Development Effectiveness earlier this year, which I would recommend as a source as well. A final point on cost is that in order to get to a better place in this area, engagement with local stakeholders and program funders will be critical to get more of such policy relevant evidence. A second, and next slide, please.
Marie, may I ask you to round up in a minute or so?
Okay, I will do so. Let me just mention that the other aspect that we have seen is that the ethical, basically we found a varied and insufficient adherence to transparent and ethical research practices across the development research field. And so, so this is something that we believe going forward we need to be better at. And 3IE has developed strong systems for producing transparent, reproducible and ethical evidence basically throughout the evaluation life cycle. And this is something that we both apply internally, but also are making available as a public good to others. I will not go through that in detail because I would like to go to the last slide and mention my last point, which is evidence literacy. It is becoming increasingly clear that we need to improve evidence literacy among us evaluators and also decision makers. So evidence is not, one thing. Evidence needs evidence needs vary across the program cycle, and therefore we need more methodological pluralism, emphasizing rigor, usefulness, and engagement. And so you see on this slide that the evidence journeys consist of some variation of various steps: agenda setting, policy formulation, adoption, implementation, and evaluation. And each step has different evidence requirements. So from problem diagnosis and root cause analysis in the early stages of agenda setting to evidence synthesis, products, and ex-ante economic evaluation informing the policy formulation stage, through to targeting, formative evaluations, process evaluations, etc. during the implementation phase, and finally to performance evaluations, impact evaluations, cost effectiveness analysis at the evaluation stage. So getting sort of an understanding of what evidence informs what kind of decisions during those different stages will be crucial. Let me just end by emphasizing that access, quality, and evidence literacy will be key areas going forward, but that these areas are necessary but not sufficient to get to better use. And I think going back to the first panel, the issue of institutionalizing evidence use through processes and incentives and a culture change in government as well as development institutions, that is basically going to be key to get to better use. Thank you, Jos.
Thank you very much, Marie. Slightly over time, but very insightful and comprehensive overview of the work of 3IE, but also more broadly, what are some of the challenges in evidence production and use? I really enjoyed your points on the scarcity of cost evidence, the importance of ethical aspects in research, and especially also the evidence literacy argument. All right, it's time to move to our next speaker in this part of the event, and it's my great pleasure to invite Sanjeev Sridharan. He is a professor of health policy evaluation at the University of Hawaii. Sanjeev,
great. Thank you. I've got to make an argument that the focus should not just be on evidence generation, but connect different pieces of evidence. As we think about a framework of use in an age in which we're talking about sustainable development goals and we're talking about inequities, we have to think about how on earth can all of this evidence contribute to building a house of care. This is quite critical because often we produce pieces of evidence. The scope in the next 6.5 minutes or so, I'll actually kind of start by unpacking this business of context, culture, and collaboration. The example I will use is homelessness in Toronto. And I want you to think about issues of inequities and intersectionalities. A few questions on our steps forward. And I think the potential here is to dream big and the potential of an ecology of evidence. So let's start here with the future of M&E, culture, context, and collaboration. I loved it. Congrats to gLOCAL for making this theme. My own critique is I think we pay lip service to these issues. More often than not, when people talk about context, it's flimsy. Culture is, again, I don't think we actually focus on it. Our theories of change don't ask around questions around collaboration. To go to the next slide, part of the specific ask is really about thinking about, should be automated, but yeah, the specific ask is about generation of evidence, thinking about how do we enhance the access of evidence, and how do we move about cultural responses. My view, as I said, is not culture generation of evidence, it's connections between different evidence. It's not about accessible evidence. I think it's looking down. It's about actually building learning with the communities. Cultural responses, how do you learn with the communities? The question I ask is around homelessness. How do you provoke, how do you precipitate system level action to reduce homelessness? Whether you're talking about maternal health or you're talking about homelessness, you're actually asking for the system to act. Too often we focus on a narrow intervention. I don't think we ask questions around how do we actually get the system to act. Right now, both in our interventions and our evaluations, the systems are remarkably, pathetically fragmented. I don't actually see us being serious about inequities and intersectionalities. Our theories of change will change if you're serious about inequities. Margin bureaucracy, high barriers. I think when we talk about evidence, we have to ask ourselves, how do we build a system of care? We have to use words like warmth, care, and love. We're not producing evidence as a mechanical act. What works for whom, but how does it provoke a low barrier philosophy? I would like to once again bring your focus on a system level care. The people we are trying to serve have trauma and despair. It's not a mechanical act, paying attention to the complexity of changing it. How do we provide shelter, warmth, and care in a quite cold world should be our question, should be our focus. The way I approach the talk is to ask you 9 hard questions in a way that respects traditional knowledge. Too much of the evidence game is talking about innovation without respecting and enhancing traditional knowledge. We've got to ask ourselves what are the limits of our knowledge and how do we actually go beyond it? Question number 1, How could we better learn from existing knowledge systems? I'm talking to you from Hawaii. I'm blown away with the Hawaiian indigenous system that is remarkably serious about issues of relationships, issues of aesthetics, issues of complexity, all of which profoundly matters for finding solutions for problems of homelessness. Two, let's be a little bit more aggressive in asking ourselves, in what ways is our knowledge systems incomplete? Too often you'll see people talking about we're going to address health equity with an intervention. That's silly. I think the question we got to ask is, how can the evaluations themselves help build a roadmap as we make the journey, given the incomplete knowledge base? And that's where I find that's one of Hawaii's most prominent explorers. I find this notion of evaluation as navigation as profound. I think too much of us are mired in evaluation as testing. If the roadmaps themselves are not clear, how do we combine different approaches like development, like summative, like formative, in a way that moves us towards our longer term goals? I love this quote. You can only know where you are in the kind of navigation by memorizing where you sail from. That means constant observation. How do we sort of keep that in mind? Too often we are mired in this program worked, that didn't work. Fourth, I think we don't take context seriously. We mutter a lot of words about context. I think just as we've asked questions on design being the focus on rigor, I think we've got to ask, does this person actually understand the context? How do we make understanding of context a critical definition of rigor itself? I think, let's be honest, more often than not, I work in maternal health in India, I work in homelessness in Toronto. There's a great gap in the act of asking questions. I think we often forget issues of trauma, issues of power, and issues of history. I think we have to ask ourselves in a very profound way, how do we avoid the colonist gaze in doing something? Too often, our accountabilities are upward. I'm not convinced we've actually kind of asked ourselves what would be the act of evidence generation in a way that we actually are responsible. So I'm actually arguing we got to go beyond silly debates on best evidence towards thinking more deeply in terms of an ecology of evidence that pays attention to building a house of care to the problems we're talking about. And I'm also arguing, let's be real, problems like health equities, we need a navigational aid. So again, how do we combine different data and analysis to get us there? That's the question. We've got to ask questions about shared accountabilities. Homelessness is not solved by an intervention. You need systems that combine. What are incentives that actually promote collaborations between organizers? I want to plug. I'm not convinced OECD's concept of coherence is good enough. We have to be arguing in what context is coherence useful, in what context is coherence itself a problem. I can have to discuss that itself. So again, I think our field has not asked questions on interactions between different interventions. Profound. Too often we play the evidence game, we don't pay attention to issues of learning. How do you build a learning system that pays attention to memory? I've worked in multiple organizations. I'm surprised at how limited memory our systems are. How do we continue to pay attention to key issues even after the project ends? I think we've not cracked that nut. I love the saying, there's no new learning, new learning, but that's some form of memory and some form of attention. So as we talk about AI and ChatGPT, etc., just remember, it's not about the patterns you identify. It's about the communities themselves saying, here's meaning here, this is utter rubbish. So you've got to ask yourself, how can learnings from a pattern recognition techniques be combined with serious community and maybe system dialogue to promote meaning? So let me return back to my original task. How does all of this actually build a house of care? And I think we have to ask ourselves, not good evidence versus bad evidence. How do we combine ourselves? My argument is pay attention to ecologies of evidence, definitely innovate, especially in learning, but pay attention to issues of context, history, and intersectionality. And most profoundly, don't be just product driven, be focused on dialogues. So I love it. I love this quote where you say, if your dreams do not scare you, they're not big enough. The size of your dreams must always exceed your current capacity to achieve them. And that's the direction I'm headed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sanjeev, for a very insightful and provocative presentation. We are moving in a field of very attractive metaphors, from a garden of M&E systems to ecologies of evidence to houses of care. I think they are very helpful in helping us understand the issues. I particularly liked your plea around getting away from intervention-centric perspectives in evaluation and truly adopt a systems perspective, and also really take context seriously and look into the complexity, which includes including the voices of the various stakeholders that are involved or affected by interventions. But a very broad array of thoughts that you brought to the table. Then it is my great pleasure and privilege to introduce our final speaker, as they say, last but not least. Our final speaker is Estelle Raimondo. Estelle is a methods advisor at the Independent Evaluation Group of the World Bank. Estelle, once you're ready with the slides, the floor is yours.
Can you tell me if you see the slides?
Yes, we can see them. We can see them.
All right,
They are
great.
up.
Thank you, Jos. I don't know about you, but I feel like I need to take a breath because there has been such an amazing amount of information, beautiful displays. The interpreters probably need to take a breath, and I'm the last, and that's already quite a bit. So if you don't want to do it, just do something else, but I need to breathe. I'm really happy to be here, and my task is to take only one of the three concepts. I thought that would be too much to do like Sanjeev and take everything on board. So I would like to share with you my conviction that in the future of evaluation practice, data science has a spot, as probably an important spot, and it has a role to play in helping us understand context. It's the concept that I will tackle to you today. And so I'm asking the question, can the two be reconciled in the future of evaluation practice? For a long time, I thought that big data, data science, artificial intelligence was actually being a threat, a danger to our understanding of context. It was pushing us to become super synthesizer, try to embrace the universe of data, and ultimately push us to not care about context anymore. But recently, with some of my work, I changed my mind. And perhaps after hearing this story, your thoughts will change too. What I would like to argue is that we have many frameworks in evaluation to think about context. Context has been part of the evaluation literature from the beginning. Many frameworks exist with obscure acronyms. Some of you might be familiar with context mechanism outcomes, CMO configurations. But when it comes to the empirics, I feel like often we don't do such a good job. We don't take context seriously. Context as the social, cultural, political, and ecological conditions within which programs and policies occurs. And I believe that data science can help us do a better job than we have in the past. So instead of doing a lot of argumentation, we're talking about practice. So I thought that a demonstration might speak for itself. So let me tell you the story of one evaluation that I led recently, which is a country program evaluation of the bank group's engagement in Morocco. Now, when it comes to IEG evaluation, country program evaluations are those where we have the best shot at doing good work with context. We are focusing on only one country, one relatively small portfolio compared to our thematic work where we have hundreds and hundreds of projects and many countries to look at. And we can typically spend a little bit more time in the country and go beyond the capital city. However, for my evaluation of Morocco, I was still under the restriction of the COVID-19 policies and I couldn't travel. And so you can imagine that I felt pretty disheartened about my ability to understand context. I couldn't be embedded in it even for a short time. I couldn't carry conversations, focus groups. And so I was fairly disheartened. And at the time, for me, data science didn't seem like a good solution to overcome this limitation. But it's probably because I couldn't do the conventional evaluation that I had to be creative, that my team had to take more risks. And so we embarked on an experiment of trying different things with data science. And I would like to show you 3 examples of what we did to unlock some of the features of the Moroccan context. First, we tried to look at the social contract And to do that, we assembled a fairly large data set coming from social media data, traditional media data, high policy statements, and we try to really understand and make sense of the dynamic over the decade that we were looking at. We used topic modeling, we used natural language processing, and ultimately we try to really map this context against the World Bank's interventions in sectors such as justice reform or female labor force participation issues. But of course, we paired this with, as much as we could, a dialogue with local experts, a dialogue with civil society organizations to help us make sense of that data. The second example has to do with the ecological context. The World Bank, the World Bank Group's engagement was to try to help Morocco overcome some of its water scarcity issues, specifically around one of the most important resources, which is the Rebiya Basin. And so what we needed to do there is to try to understand the dynamic of the ecological system around the basin for 10 years. And so that required doing some geospatial analysis, looking at the agricultural landscape evolutions, trying to map evapotranspiration, rainfall, runoff to try to estimate the water budget, and try to understand how that affected the population living around the basin. And so here data science was also helpful in our dialogue with public administrators and also remote interviewing, as well as focus groups that were conducted by local consultants as data input for these conversations. Finally, I'd venture to say that most of our organizations are very suffering from an organization bias, right? When we go in an evaluation setting, we always tend to overestimate the impact of our own organizations. And so we typically try to do a few interviews here and there, but we don't always take data seriously. So here we use data science techniques again to try to have a very granular mapping of the World Bank Group's intervention in the context of many other actors and donors at the sector level and also geolocated. And here it helped us evaluate the comparative advantage of the World Bank Group better at the institutional context level. So just to wrap up, after this experience, I kind of recalibrated my own thinking around how big data, data science, and artificial intelligence can help us do a better job at context. Of course, it's not a silver bullet. Of course, it's not a replacement for embedded qualitative inquiry, participatory work, but I venture to say that it can be a good companion in that journey. There are conditions, of course, for this to work well. You need a good evaluation framework that has been really thought through with local experts as well. You need synergies of expertise between data science, evaluation experts, and of course, local know-how, local expertise in policies and spaces. And finally, you need humility and transparency around the limitations of your study and also some of the risks and dangers in applying these techniques. Thank you very much for keeping the attention up after all of these great presentation. Let me stop.
Thank you very much, Estelle. And as I said, last but not least, thank you very much for demystifying the use of data science applications in evaluation and elucidating some of your experiences of using textual data or imagery data and using data science applications to really help complement evaluative analysis and also deal with the constraints that you were facing at that time when the COVID-19 pandemic hit. Excellent presentation, thank you. So, esteemed colleagues, please keep on inputting questions in the Q&A box as we open the conversation. I would like to follow up with a few questions to our panelists. And let me start with you, Estelle, as we are still in the data science sphere. Let me ask you one question also which relates to your role as methods advisor and dealing with different teams doing all sorts of different things in the design and implementation of the evaluations. In your experience and looking forward, how do you think will the application of data science applications really change or even transform evaluative practice in the coming years? Do we need to be afraid or optimistic? What is happening?
Thanks, yes. I think we need to be optimistic, but we need to be cautious. I don't know about afraid, but we need to be cautious. I think there are still some colleagues who are resisting the idea, saying, this is the last flavor of the month and perhaps it will go away. I don't think so. I think we need to embrace some of the innovations that are happening. We need to experiment, but we need to do that with a lot of caution and some kind of risk management practices. There are Dugan was saying you need to write good probe for ChatGPT. Before that, we need to know more about GPT models. We need to engage in the governance of data. We need to make sure that the private data privacy are respected. And so there is a whole ethical dimension that Marie also talked about. But we can't be in our corner of the world and let the rest of the world start experimenting. We have knowledge and know-how of how to do great things with data, and we should be part of those conversations when it comes to the governance of big data. So cautiously optimistic.
Thank you very much. I think many colleagues would share that view. Very helpful. Let me move on to Marie and ask a question about how you think the evidence architecture and the evidence use is moving forward more broadly. So 3IE, similar to some other organizations like Campbell and others, have really been investing in structured evidence production and sharing, not just at the level of specific interventions, but also at higher levels, at the level of types of interventions or thematic areas of intervention. So in your view, what is needed to encourage decision makers and other policy stakeholders to really tap into these resources? There's probably a technical constraint. There may be other constraints. And also, what is needed to convince stakeholders to also contribute to the growth of this evidence base, which, as we know, is an important global public good?
Yeah, thanks, Jos. Great questions. And I think easy things to grow it is basically to make sure more people know about it. So thanks also to this event. I'm hoping many more that are attending will be actually using the portal and visiting it. But also, I think back to the first session today, in terms of actually institutionalizing evidence use. So like Haf did, so you don't get to go to our board unless you have looked at existing evidence. I would, by the way, argue that not using existing evidence is unethical. So, but how do you get these kind of requirements into systems? And that's something that can be done across organizations. Start looking at that also in governments. The best users, I think, of several of these tools are often the sort of the help desk type, who are trained to actually know how to extract what is there and complement it with more localized relevant evidence and contextualize it to local questions, etc. So often it's not that easy to use in a smart way, and trained people and help desks can help. And then the last issue is it is a public good. We are struggling to update this. There are several thousand impact evaluations and many more systematic reviews coming out every year, and we know that a lot of users. We hear it every time we have meetings, when we engage with institutions and governments. There are lots of users, but there are very, very few who are willing to pay for this public good. And so having sort of that kind of discussions. And finally, there's also tendencies to duplications and new portals being developed where a large one already exists, etc. So again, some sort of organized approach, I think, would be helpful.
Thank you very much, Marie, and especially also the last point. We see that in capacity development in general, that there is a need for more coordination and collaboration. And we see it also in your part of the evidence community, that there is duplication of work. So that's an excellent point. We need to really collaborate so we optimize our global public goods. And 3IE has done excellent work in this regard. So thank you. Right, then a question for Sanjeev. Sanjeev, you brought up a number of very interesting issues in your presentation. You may agree or may not that some people think that there is something of a tension between what we could call good practices for conducting evaluation research on the one hand, and on the other hand, really bringing on board indigenous knowledge, developing a culturally responsive evaluation approach. Is this tension, is this a real one, or is this a false tension? How can we reconcile both?
I think it's a real one. And I think we need to go away from adjectives like good practice and really appreciate that we are in our infancy of practice. It's an evolutionary field. We should not be patting ourselves on the back and saying we've sort of nailed the problem. My points are very simple. More often, I work a lot with Ray Posson, who works a lot on realistic, who's the lead of realist evaluation. My number one question to him is, how do you know someone's taken context seriously? The same attention we've paid to what's a good design, experimental or otherwise, we've not paid to answering what's a good enough theory. How does this person know what the heck they're talking about when they mention context? Point number one. Point number two, whether it's an indigenous community or otherwise, indigenous knowledge or otherwise. So my comments, I don't think we actually kind of specify what other things are needed for our interventions to work. Very often we'll report a subgroup analysis that says there's a difference between men and women. I don't think that's really a serious exploration of context or support structures. We do an abysmal job of actually incorporating heterogeneity of how different stakeholders view the different interventions. It's pathetic. And so let's be serious about not congratulating ourselves on good practice and actually kind of say, here are areas for them. This is really important for indigenous communities. I'm not sure where our timelines of change come from. Often it's decided from outside, from Delhi or from Washington, DC, etc. What are communities' voice? And I work in indigenous communities in Canada and Hawaii, and I think that sense of time of change is real. So what are we talking about? The golden days of evaluation, etc. If we are not doing the basics. 5, in terms of a long-term goal, it's not your intervention. How do we think about systems, etc.? So all of this is to say, the really exciting thing about an event like this is to say this is an evolutionary field and these are issues we need to crack. And I think we need to get ourselves away from being the sole arbiter of what constitutes rigor. And I think by actually kind of saying there are a number of areas in which much work remains before we define rigor. So I see hope, I see practice, but I think a lot of it depends on how you approach your own evaluations. Over.
Hence the term ecology of evidence, which I really appreciate. Thank you very much, Sanjeev. Esteemed colleagues, we are slowly nearing the end of our event, and while we hugely appreciate the avalanche of questions, there's no way that we can go through them. So instead, I would just would like to propose to all 5 panelists to quickly scroll through the questions or through their memory. And I would like to give all 5 panelists a very brief opportunity to bring in some last words, really pertaining to the key questions. What are some of the main prospects and challenges for evaluation monitoring to move forward in the near future, either at the systems level or at the practice level? Knowing that Dugan is eloquent and well-informed, I will ask him to start. Over to you, Dugan. Very short.
There's been so much eloquence. I'm really impressed by the work of my colleagues, and I'm loving a few of the ideas that I ran into today, particularly Sanjeev's thinking about. It's a long time since I heard anybody in a public policy context talking about love. And I think that is really so important to foreground and bring that to the heart of what we are talking about, because these are all intended to create care and kindness. And I think that if we do that through building strong ecologies of evidence, that's also amazing. But what I also really loved, you see, I get to see Candice and Estelle, but I loved Marie's evidence along a decision maker's journey. And what I find very, very heartening is that it feels like we are reaching a place where people are starting to say, in this journey, which we're very early in, there are many, many types of evidence and many ways of producing and using it. And I feel like we are collaborating and intending to collaborate in a way that's really exciting. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Dugan. I knew that I should let you talk instead of myself because you're a very good synthesizer. May I ask Candice to come in briefly?
Thanks so much, Jos. I've really enjoyed this session. My colleagues have been brilliant. There are so many questions, so I'm going to pick one that I think is almost the one that we need to really be able to answer in our work going forward in national evaluation systems. And it's Flora by Florence Eta, and she's asking, are we being naive in believing in a state that desires the true picture that M&E can or may provide for politicians or bureaucrats whose interests may be different from what we or the masses may have? And I think in the context of today's discussion on the importance of context and, really locally indigenized systems of evidence production and use, I think where we really have gotten it wrong is that we've forgotten completely about the fact that there are people, citizens, who also have a stake in national evaluation systems. We talk about non-state actors as being non-governmental organizations or civil society in general as organized civil society. But I argue that also we need to advocate for citizens, you and I and others who are non-evaluators, to understand the importance of demanding evidence in the bureaucratic machinery and in the state and how governance actually happens, how decisions actually happen. I think if we bring in and we get kind of a tidal wave of people understanding, first of all, the value of M&E, and we need to do a lot more activism in that space. And the demand will be then from the bottom up as well. We need to also try to understand those indigenous systems of evidence production. How do we bring those into kind of the more colonial type systems of evidence production that are in our forms of the state? So in the end, I think it's about activism. As evaluators and evaluation enthusiasts, we need to become more activists. Thank you.
Thank you, Candice. And giving smart people 1 minute always means that they have 3 minutes. But what you said was really very insightful. And I think we all need to become better advocates, and hopefully gLOCAL will help us become that. Then may I ask Marie to come in for a few last observations?
Yeah, I think coming in third here is very hard. So I'll try not to repeat what others have said. I think I really do believe that the biggest challenge is on sort of the incentives and the sort of culture of evidence, and how do you change that in institutions and government, and that we can become as good as we want and generate better, improved, localized evidence, and it will still not be used until we actually work on those incentives, on the signals from the top in organizations, and ensure that that trickles down through incentives also at staff, let's say annual performance reviews, things like that, things that matter to people who can change things. I think that thinking that through. And then the other point that I keep thinking is, we kind of know where, I think where there's a lot of common ground, for example, in this panel. I think there's the funders of evaluations aren't necessarily sufficiently aware of the kind of things we're talking about, and that's a real dilemma for some of us who want to sort of push in the right direction. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Marie. I think the next one in line is Sanjeev, and appreciate it if you can be concise, Sanjeev. Thank you.
I think we need to take our remit for SDGs seriously, and that means thinking through how do we need to change our frameworks for inequities and leaving no person behind more seriously. This requires us to think in more creative ways than the received wisdom. And we also have to think through how do we build systems that have memory, and we go beyond, the project funding. Let me stop here. Over.
Excellent, Sanjeev. Estelle, last but not least again.
I think we all need to take more risks. That's it. We don't have time. I mean, we are at our infancy, but we're running out of time on many things. So we need to take more risks, experiment more, and like Marie would say, just wait until you're apprehended. But you can do a lot of things. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Estelle. And indeed, there's a sense of urgency given the global issues that we have to deal with on this planet through policy intervention. And hopefully M&E can contribute to that, to addressing these constructively and effectively. So I think by means of summary, that was it. I will not try to capture the main ideas of this event. I hope you found the event very enriching and insightful. I certainly did. Before I hand it over to Patricia with some final remarks on gLOCAL, let me just thank you all for your attention and thank the panelists for their excellent, rich interventions. And hopefully we will see you in some of the upcoming gLOCAL events. Tomorrow there will be an event on the academic directory on training programs in evaluation, the first ever global directory. Hopefully we'll see some of you there, but there are many other events organized by partners across the globe. So thank you all, and now over to you, Patricia.
Thank you, Jos, and thank to you for the excellent moderation of the session, and to our panelists. Yes, just reiterating that we have over 300 events organized this week, so we hope to see you participating in this event and to let us other people know that to join the event. If you liked these sessions, maybe you had a flavor of what the week is going to be like. I just would like to close by saying that it would be great if we can reimagine the role of evaluation, break new ground and forge a path towards a better and more equitable world. And so we hope that we are all working towards that. Thank you for being part of this event, and again, enjoying the gLOCAL Evaluation Week 2023. Bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.